The smell came first, always the smell. Promethium residue and rendered fat, thick enough to coat your tongue, seeping through the rebreather filters we weren't issued, because the mortality projections didn't justify the expense. I stopped breathing through my mouth on my second shift. By my 100th, I'd learned to breathe so shallowly that my chest barely moved. That was 3 years before I understood why it mattered. My designation was Manufactorum Technician 3rd Class Hab Block Sigma 7, Sub-Level 19. 26 billion souls churned through the Hive City's lower industrial districts. I was a decimal point in a footnote to a report no one would read. The overseers told us we were the Emperor's hands shaping the instruments of his will. What they meant was, you are replaceable and replacement is cheaper than repair. The assembly line stretched 14 kilometers through corridors so narrow your shoulders scraped both walls. We assembled trigger mechanisms for standard pattern lasguns. 11,000 units per shift, 48 shifts per solar rotation. The quota increased every month. The shifts never shortened. I worked beside a woman named Keller for 18 months before I learned her name. Speech was inefficiency, and inefficiency was scrutinized. She had 3 fingers on her left hand. The stamping press had taken the others during her first year. She'd wrap the stumps herself and return to the line within the hour because the Medicae hall was 14 levels up, and absenteeism triggered administratum review. I never learned what happened to people who got reviewed. They simply weren't there anymore. Their designation tags appeared on new workers within a day, sometimes within the hour. The turnover rate was quantified in our performance briefs, acceptable wastage. We were a renewable resource, harvested from the underhive slums where population density exceeded sustainability metrics by 400%. Bodies were the one commodity that never ran short. The Hive City rose 17 kilometers above the Manufactorum levels and descended 43 kilometers below. I'd been born somewhere in the middle strata, in a hab unit shared by 14 families, where you slept in shifts because there weren't enough beds and worked in shifts because there weren't enough jobs. My mother had assembled the same trigger mechanisms I now assembled. So had her mother. 3 generations of our bloodline had worked the same 14-kilometer line, producing the same components, meeting the same quotas. When my mother's lungs finally crystallized from the chemical exposure, they'd given her designation to me before her body reached the reclamation furnaces. I was 12 years old. That was 23 years ago. I'm 35 now, though the Hive City's work records list me as 28 because I'd stolen an older child's identification papers to qualify for adult labor assignments. The pay was marginally better, not enough to escape the lower industrial sectors, but enough to afford protein paste twice a week instead of pure carbohydrate slurry. I thought I was being clever. I thought I was surviving. I didn't understand that the stolen years meant I'd been breathing the toxins longer than my body could compensate for, that the extra pay was just advance payment on my death. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was hallucinating from the chem fumes. You worked 16-hour shifts in ventilation that barely cycled, hypoxia was common, tox delirium expected. We'd been warned about the visions during our initial orientation, a 3-hour briefing conducted in a chamber that held 4,000 new workers, standing room only, while a servitor with a damaged Vox unit recited safety protocols no one could hear over the ambient machinery noise. The message was clear: if you saw things that weren't there, ignore them and continue working. Stopping to investigate hallucinations reduced output and triggered performance flags. But I wasn't delirious. The woman 3 stations down, designation unknown, had stopped moving. Her hands hung frozen over the assembly vise, a half-finished trigger mechanism still clamped in the jaws. She'd been in that position for 20 minutes. I'd counted because counting was the only way to mark time when the chronometers were deliberately obscured to prevent slowdown during final shift hours. The chronometers had been covered 3 years into my service. Before that, you could track the shifts, measure how much time remained before rest cycle. Workers would slow their pace as shift end approached, conserving energy for the final push. The efficiency analysts calculated that this anticipatory slowdown cost 17 minutes of productivity per worker per shift. The solution was simple: remove the ability to anticipate, paint over the chronometers, eliminate all external time references. Let workers exist in an eternal present where shift end came without warning and the next shift began before exhaustion could fully register. It worked. Productivity increased by 19%. Worker casualties increased by 34%, exhaustion-related accidents primarily. But the cost-benefit analysis showed acceptable margins. Bodies were cheaper than lost productivity. No one noticed the dead woman. The overseers paced their catwalks overhead, electrogodes crackling with casual menace. The servitors trundled past on their programmed routes, optical sensors sweeping our movements for statistical analysis. The workers on either side of her maintained their rhythms, hands moving in the mechanical precision that survival demanded, and she stayed frozen, fingers curled around components she'd never complete. I watched her. I couldn't help it. There was something hypnotic about her stillness amid the constant motion of the line. The way her body held its position despite the absence of life, as if the habit of work had calcified into something deeper than voluntary action. Her station's output conveyor continued moving, carrying away the last few components she'd completed before death. The belt's motion created the illusion that her station was still productive, still meeting quota. It took 43 minutes before an overseer noticed. Not because she'd stopped working, because her station's output had created a gap in the line's flow. The man 3 stations ahead of her had run out of the subcomponents she was supposed to provide. His station's output rate dropped. The servitor monitoring his sector flagged the deviation. The overseer descended with the administrative certainty of a man following a decision tree: reduced output, identify cause, rectify, resume standard operations. The overseer descended, electrogode raised, and prodded her shoulder. She toppled sideways off her stool with the stiffness of something that had been dead for an hour. The smell intensified, bowels released in death, a smell that barely registered against the background reek. They dragged her away. Someone else took her station before the next quota interval. The line never stopped. The replacement was a boy who couldn't have been more than 14, though his identification must have claimed otherwise. He had the skeletal thinness of someone who'd grown up in the underhive sump levels, where malnutrition was so endemic that the administratum factored reduced physical capacity into their labor projections. He moved with the desperate quickness of someone who understood that slowness meant death. His hands shook as he assembled his first trigger mechanism. The servitor monitoring his output noted a 47% efficiency deviation and flagged him for performance review. He lasted 6 days. On the 7th, I arrived at shift to find someone else at his station. I never learned what happened to him. The administratum reviews happened in offices 17 levels above our work areas, processed by functionaries who reviewed production statistics and worker metrics without ever seeing the people behind the numbers. If you were flagged, you disappeared. Your designation was reassigned. The system moved on. I became obsessed with watching after that, counting the seconds between movement, cataloging the micro-variations that distinguished exhaustion from death. The oversight systems tracked our output, our efficiency, our deviation from standard performance metrics. But they didn't track whether we were alive, only whether we were producing. And if you died in a position that allowed your body to maintain the motion, if your weight kept your hands in place and gravity provided enough momentum, the servitor's visual analysis algorithms didn't flag the discrepancy. I began documenting it. Not officially, that would have been insane. But in my head I maintained a count: 3 dead workers in my immediate sector during my first month of observation, 7 the next month, 12 the month after that. The numbers varied seasonally. During the summer heat cycles, when the hive city's temperature regulation failed and the manufacturing levels became blast furnaces, the count could reach 25 in a single month. During the winter, when hypothermia added a new variable to our mortality equations, the numbers dropped slightly. Cold preserved bodies longer, made them more functional for extended periods. Keller noticed me noticing. She leaned close during a mandated hydration interval, 40 seconds twice per shift, and whispered with breath that smelled like chemical burns, 14 so far this month. They're called ghosts. Her eyes were yellowed from hepatotoxicity, same as mine, same as everyone's. Management knows. The quotas account for it. 1 ghost can run a station for an hour, sometimes 2. That's efficiency they don't have to pay for. I wanted to call her insane. I wanted to report her for defeatism and seditious speech. The punishment for spreading morale-damaging rumors was reassignment to the reclamation furnaces, not as workers but as fuel. They never explicitly stated this, it was just understood. Workers who spoke against the system disappeared, and the furnaces burned hotter for a few days. But I'd counted 17 corpses in 6 weeks, and 12 of them had kept working long enough to meet their interval quotas. The overseers only intervened when the bodies began to affect the line's output. Until then, they watched from their catwalks and adjusted nothing. Keller had been there longer than anyone else in our sector. 9 years, she told me during another hydration interval 3 months later. 9 years of breathing toxins and assembling trigger mechanisms, and watching people die at their stations. She'd lost her fingers, most of her lung capacity, and whatever optimism she'd arrived with. But she'd developed something else, an understanding of the system's true mechanics. How it functioned not despite our deaths, but because of them. They're refining it, she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the machinery noise. Every year, the quotas increase. Every year, more of us die at our stations. Every year, they measure how long the bodies keep working and adjust the projections. We're not workers anymore. We're prototypes. They're testing how far they can push biological labor before it fails, and then they're measuring how much productivity they can extract from the failure. I didn't believe her. Not then. It was too grotesque, too deliberately cruel. The Imperium's bureaucracy was vast and indifferent, but there was a difference between indifference and intentional malice. Wasn't there? That was when I started testing how long I could hold completely still. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes, while my hands maintained their programmed motions through muscle memory so deeply ingrained it operated independent of conscious thought. I could feel my pulse slowing, my breathing becoming imperceptible. I watched the servitors pass without pausing. The overseer's gazes swept over me without stopping. 3 minutes. 4. My vision tunneled. My fingers continued their work. When I finally drew a full breath, no one reacted, no alarms triggered, no overseer descended to verify my status. I had disappeared while standing in plain sight, and the only thing that made me visible again was the expansion of my lungs. I began experimenting, testing the boundaries of invisibility. I discovered that if I maintained my station's output while reducing my breathing to less than 3 breaths per minute, the biometric sensors embedded in our workstations registered me as equipment rather than personnel. The sensors tracked heat, motion, and respiratory patterns, but they were calibrated to flag deviations, not absences. If you fell below the threshold of measurable biological function while maintaining productivity, you simply ceased to exist in the system's awareness. This was intentional. It had to be. The sensors were sophisticated enough to detect a worker's heart rate through thermal imaging, sensitive enough to flag a fever before symptoms became visible. They could have been calibrated to detect any biological presence. Instead, They were calibrated to detect biological deviation. The system didn't care if you were alive, only if you were deviating from standard performance parameters. I shared this discovery with Keller. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret, something between pity and recognition. "You're starting to understand," she said. "They don't need us alive. They need us productive. If we can be productive while dead, that's preferable. Dead workers don't require food, don't require rest, don't require medical intervention. Don't organize, don't protest, don't slow down as shift end approaches because they don't anticipate anything anymore." "That's insane," I said. "That's efficient," she corrected, "and efficiency is the only virtue the administratum recognizes." Keller died 4 months later. I didn't see it happen. She was 16 stations down the line by then, reassigned after her remaining fingers became too damaged for precision work. They'd moved her to a station that required only gross motor function, hauling completed components from one conveyor to another. Simple work, the kind they gave to workers who were failing but not yet failed enough to justify disposal. But I knew the moment it occurred because the overseer's whistle blew in Sector 7 and the servitors converged with their collection hooks. Her replacement was working within 10 minutes. I never learned if she'd stopped breathing intentionally or if her body simply gave out. The distinction didn't matter to the quota assessments. I went to see her body before they loaded it into the reclamation furnaces. This was technically forbidden. Workers weren't supposed to leave their assigned sectors during shift hours, but I'd discovered that if you moved with the confidence of someone on official business, if you carried a requisition form or an equipment manifest, the overseers assumed you were authorized. The system was too vast for them to memorize every worker's assigned sector. They relied on challenges to the obviously unauthorized. If you looked like you belonged, you were invisible. The reclamation level stank worse than the manufacturum. Here, they processed everything the Hive City discarded: broken equipment, contaminated materials and bodies. Lots of bodies. The furnaces ran continuously, fed by servitors who sorted the dead with the same mechanical precision we used to assemble lasguns. Corpses were weighed, documented, and assigned a reclamation value based on their remaining usable biomass. The very old and very young yielded less. Workers from the toxic sectors yielded the least. Our bodies were so saturated with industrial chemicals that the reclamation processors had to adjust their combustion parameters to prevent contamination of the resulting corpse starch. I found Keller's body in a holding pen with 47 others, waiting for processing. Her eyes were still open. Her remaining fingers were still curved in the shape of the components she'd been moving. Even in death, her body retained the posture of labor. I stood there for 17 minutes before an overseer noticed me. "You're not assigned to this sector," he said. Not a question, a statement requiring explanation. "Familial review," I lied. Administratum Regulation 47/12 requires documentation of deceased relatives for inheritance processing. This was complete fabrication. But it sounded sufficiently bureaucratic, and the overseer couldn't risk contradicting an administratum regulation he might not know. The system had so many rules that no one person could know them all. The functionaries relied on this. Spouting regulation numbers with sufficient confidence usually prevented challenges. 5 minutes, the overseer said. "Document your review and return to your assigned sector." I nodded, approached Keller's body, pretended to examine her designation tag while I looked at what 9 years in the manufacturum had done to her. Her skin had the texture of badly cured leather, cracked and discolored from chemical exposure. Her lungs had been so damaged that I could see the outline of her ribs through her work uniform, the skeletal prominence of someone who'd been slowly suffocating for years. Her remaining hand was a ruin of scar tissue and chemical burns. She'd been 34 years old. The system listed her as 27. Apparently I wasn't the only one who'd stolen identification to qualify for adult labor. She'd worked herself to death across 9 years, and the reclamation assessment valued her body at 43 credits, barely enough to justify the fuel cost of her cremation. I returned to my station. I assembled trigger mechanisms. I counted the seconds between breaths and discovered I could extend them to 5 minutes now. 6, 7. The world took on a dreamlike quality when you starved your brain of oxygen. Edges softened, sounds became distant, the horror of existence acquired a bearable numbness. I began volunteering for double shifts, then triple shifts. The overseers approved immediately. Voluntary overwork reduced labor costs and increased individual output metrics. They didn't question why. They didn't care. I wanted to understand the threshold, the exact point where exhaustion crossed into death, where your body continued moving after your consciousness departed. I wanted to know how long you could be dead and still be useful. The manufactorum operated continuously. There was no day or night in the sublevels, only the artificial lighting that cycled through intensity variations to simulate circadian rhythms. During the supposed night hours, the lights dimmed to a red that barely penetrated the chemical haze. During the day, they brightened to a yellow that was still dimmer than real sunlight. I'd seen real sunlight once when I was 7 years old. My mother had taken me to the upper levels for some administratum processing, identity confirmation, I think. We'd passed a viewing port that looked out over the hive city's exterior. The sun had been setting. The sky was the color of infected wounds, orange and purple and red, the pollution from billions of manufactorums painting the atmosphere. But it was real light, unfiltered, unprocessed. It hurt to look at, and I couldn't look away. My mother had pulled me past after 30 seconds, but I'd carried that image for 28 years. Sometimes during the longest shifts, I'd close my eyes and try to remember what it looked like. The memory had degraded over time, becoming less like a real experience and more like a story I'd told myself so many times it had replaced the original. I wondered if Keller had ever seen sunlight. I never got to ask her. The triple shifts destroyed whatever remained of my health. I could feel my body failing in incremental ways, my vision developing black spots that wouldn't clear, my joints grinding with cartilage damage, my digestion becoming unreliable. I stopped eating during shifts because the nausea was worse than the hunger. I stopped drinking except during the mandated hydration intervals because the manufacturum's water supply was barely filtered and tasted like the chemicals we worked with. My body weight dropped. My hands developed a tremor that took the first 30 minutes of each shift to suppress. But my output metrics remained consistent. That was all that mattered. The manufacturum's deeper sections processed materials too toxic for standard workers. We called them the burn levels, where the air itself was corrosive and life expectancy was measured in months. Transfer there was punitive, assigned to workers who'd failed efficiency reviews or violated conduct protocols. I requested transfer. The administrator who processed my application looked at me for 3 seconds longer than necessary, the first time in 4 years anyone had looked at me at all, and approved the requisition without comment. I understood why during my first shift in the burn levels. Every worker there was dead, not metaphorically, literally deceased but still functioning. Their designation tags showed green status. Their output metrics were within acceptable ranges. But their eyes were empty, and their skin had the waxy translucence of advanced necrosis. They moved with the mechanical precision of servitors, following programmed motions without awareness or deviation. The overseer who conducted my orientation didn't mention this. He showed me my station, explained the output requirements, and left. No safety briefing, no chemical exposure warnings, no discussion of life expectancy. The orientation lasted 90 seconds. I learned the truth within hours. The chemicals here weren't just toxic, they were preservative. The atmosphere was so saturated with industrial compounds that organic tissue absorbed them at the cellular level, replacing water content with substances that prevented decay. You didn't decompose in the burn levels, you mummified. And mummified tissue retained functionality far longer than normal dead flesh. The workers here were useful for months after death. Their muscles retained enough electric potential to continue programmed motions. Their stations showed green on the output monitors. The overseers never descended to verify. Why would they? The productivity was excellent. I worked my first shift surrounded by corpses that walked and assembled and met quota without rest or complaint. The smell here was different, not the organic rot of normal death, but something chemical and sweet, like burnt sugar and formaldehyde. It coated everything. By the end of my first shift, I could taste it in the back of my throat. By the end of my first week, it had seeped into my pores. I smelled like the dead because I was becoming the dead. The burn levels were different in other ways too. The lighting was dimmer. The dead didn't need good visibility. The temperature was lower. Preserving tissue required cooler conditions. The overseers patrolled less frequently. What was there to supervise? The servitors handled material delivery and collection. The output monitors tracked productivity. The workers required no guidance because they'd moved beyond the capacity for deviation. I met another living worker during my third week, a woman named Hess, though she didn't tell me her name until we'd worked adjacent stations for a month. She'd been in the burn levels for 7 months, she said. She was the only living worker in a sector of 214 stations. "Why are you here?" I asked during a moment when the nearest servitor had passed out of auditory range. "Efficiency violation," she said. Her voice was hoarse, damaged from breathing the corrosive atmosphere. I questioned why our quota increased while our pay decreased. The overseer filed a grievance report. The administratum transferred me here as corrective action. How long until? I didn't finish the question. I didn't need to. 2 months, maybe 3, she said. I can feel it starting. The chemicals are saturating my tissues. My reflexes are slowing. My sense of taste is gone. My skin doesn't feel pain anymore. I cut myself yesterday and didn't notice until I saw the blood. She held up her hand. The cut was there, partially healed but surrounded by tissue that looked waxy and discolored. The process is incremental. You don't die all at once. You die in pieces, and each piece that dies keeps working. Why don't you request transfer, medical intervention? She laughed. It sounded like something breaking. Transfer where? Every sector has the same conditions, just different degrees. Medical intervention for what? There's no cure for chemical saturation. Your body absorbs the toxins, and they become part of your cellular structure. You'd have to replace every cell to fix it, and that's not possible. The best the Medicae could do is document my decline and recommend me for reclamation when functionality drops below acceptable thresholds. So we just wait to die? We work until we die, she corrected, and then we keep working. Hess died 6 weeks later. I watched it happen. We were working adjacent stations when she suddenly stopped mid-motion. Her hands froze over her assembly. Her breathing became imperceptible. For 40 seconds, nothing moved. Then her hands started again, continuing the motion they'd been performing when consciousness departed. Her eyes stayed empty. Her chest didn't rise. I reached over and touched her shoulder. Her skin was cold and rigid, no pulse in her neck, no response to stimuli. She was dead. But her hands continued working. I reported this to the overseer during his weekly sector inspection. Station 43's worker is deceased, I said. He checked his data slate. Station 43's output is within acceptable parameters. Productivity rated at 92% standard, no intervention required. But she's dead. Her designation shows active status. Her biometric data is flagged as sensor malfunction. Her output remains consistent. He looked at me with the flat indifference of a man reciting established protocol. Unless output falls below acceptable thresholds, no intervention is required. Return to your station. I returned to my station. I worked adjacent to Hess's corpse for the next 3 months. Her body never collapsed. Her hands never stopped moving. Her station's output actually improved. Dead workers didn't slow down as fatigue accumulated. They maintained consistent pace from shift start to shift end. Eventually, her body began to fail structurally. Her right arm dislocated at the shoulder, hanging at an unnatural angle while her left arm continued working. The output rate dropped. The overseer noted the deviation and dispatched servitors to remove her. Her replacement arrived within the hour. The replacement lasted 2 months before she died at her station. Her corpse worked for another 4 months before structural failure required removal. I began documenting everything. Not officially, I had no data slate, no recording equipment, no means of creating permanent records. But in my head I maintained detailed logs, worker designations, time to death, time from death to removal, output consistency rates, observable stages of chemical saturation. I memorized it all because memory was the only database I controlled. The patterns emerged over months of observation. Workers in the burn levels typically died within 4 to 7 months of arrival. Their corpses remained functional for an additional 3 to 6 months, depending on their size and chemical saturation levels. Larger workers lasted longer. More tissue mass meant more preserved muscle structure. Workers who'd been in the manufacturing for years before transfer to the burn levels died faster, but remained functional longer. Their bodies were pre-saturated with preservative compounds. The efficiency calculations were obvious. Living workers required food, water, rest cycles, and medical intervention. Dead workers required nothing except occasional removal when structural failure became too severe. The cost savings were enormous. A sector of dead workers could produce at 90% the output of living workers while consuming zero resources. The administrator knew this. They had to. The burn levels weren't a coincidence, they were a laboratory, a testing ground for optimized labor models. Every worker transferred here was a data point in a larger experiment, how to extract maximum productivity from minimum investment. I was a data point too. My transfer had been approved without question because they wanted to see how long I'd last, how long I'd remain productive, how my particular biological parameters would interact with the chemical saturation process. I decided to give them anomalous data. I began controlling my breathing systematically. I practiced during shifts until I could reduce my respiratory rate to 1 breath per minute, then 1 breath per 2 minutes, then 1 breath per 5. My body adapted. The oxygen deprivation caused damage. I could feel my cognitive function declining, my memory becoming unreliable, my coordination requiring active concentration. But my hands remembered the work. The muscle memory was carved so deep that conscious thought became optional. The biometric sensors stopped tracking me. My respiration fell below their detection thresholds. My body temperature dropped as my metabolism slowed. My heart rate became irregular and barely measurable. According to the sensors, I'd transitioned from worker to equipment. My designation remained active, but the system stopped flagging me for biological monitoring. I had become invisible. I tested this systematically. During shift hours, I walked away from my station, crossed sectors, stood in the middle of patrol routes. The overseers walked past without acknowledging my presence. The servitors' optical sensors swept over me and registered nothing. I'd fallen below the threshold of recognition. I was simultaneously documented and unobservable. I explored the manufactorum's full extent during these experimental walkabouts. 73 sectors across 19 sub-levels, processing everything from last triggers to void suit seals. Each sector had its own characteristics, different chemical compositions, different mortality rates, different ratios of living to dead workers. Sector 17 processed munitions casings. The chemical exposure there caused accelerated neurological decay. Workers typically lost motor control within 3 months, but the station designs compensated. harnesses and mechanical supports that held bodies in position even after voluntary muscle control ceased. The workers there were effectively paralyzed but still productive. Their hands were strapped to assembly tools that guided the motion mechanically. They didn't need to move, they just needed to not resist the motion. Sector 29 processed optical components for targeting systems. The work required precision that dead workers couldn't maintain. This sector had the highest ratio of living workers in the entire manufactorum, nearly 40%. But the turnover rate was catastrophic. The precision requirements meant that even minor tremors from exhaustion resulted in defect rates that triggered performance flags. Workers were cycled through rapidly, replaced the moment their output consistency dropped below acceptable thresholds. Sector 42 processed chemical coolant systems. The atmosphere there was so toxic that workers wore full environment suits, poorly maintained, with filters that needed replacement far more frequently than they received it. I watched a worker's suit fail during shift. The atmospheric exposure killed her in 90 seconds. Her body convulsed, skin blistering and sloughing off as the chemicals dissolved her epidermis. The servitors removed her corpse. Her replacement was suited and working within 5 minutes. On sub-level 4, I found a worker who'd been dead so long her skeleton had partially collapsed, held upright only by the support harness required for her station's posture. Her hands were still moving. Bone fingers manipulating components through motions carved so deep into her nervous system they'd outlived the meat. Her output metrics were green. No one had noticed that she was now a skeleton operating a workstation. I tried to remove her, to give her whatever dignity a proper disposal might provide. But when I touched her harness, an alarm triggered. A servitor appeared within seconds, electroprod crackling, unauthorized interference with productive equipment, it stated in its flat mechanical voice. Return to assigned station or face disciplinary action. Productive equipment. That's what she was now, not a person, not even a corpse. Equipment. I returned to my assigned station. I worked my shift. I breathed once every 7 minutes and watched my hands assemble components I no longer consciously directed. On sub-level 27, I found the ghost sector. 73 stations, all staffed by corpses, all producing at above average efficiency. No living workers, no overseers. Just servitors performing maintenance cycles and material delivery. The line ran at 94% efficiency, better than most living sectors. I spent an entire shift there, watching the dead work. They moved with perfect synchronization, no wasted motion, no inefficiency. They never slowed, never paused, never deviated. They were the perfect workers, all the productivity of human labor, without any of the inconvenient humanity. Management had classified it as a pilot program. I found the documentation during one of my exploratory periods. The administrative levels were less secure than they believed. If you moved with confidence and wore the right kind of worn clothing, you looked like maintenance rather than infiltration. I found the file rooms where physical records were stored for redundancy, vast archives of paper documentation that backed up the digital systems. The file was labeled Metabolic Efficiency Reduction Initiative, Phase 3 Results. It detailed the ghost sector's establishment, operational parameters, and productivity metrics. The language was clinical. Phrases like post-biological labor retention and extended asset utilization described the process of working corpses until they physically disintegrated. The financial projections were staggering. A full transition to post-biological labor across all manufactorum sectors would reduce operating costs by 67% while increasing output by 41%. The dead didn't just work, they worked better, more consistently, more efficiently, more profitably. The report's recommendations section proposed expanded implementation, establish additional ghost sectors, accelerate chemical saturation protocols in living workers to reduce time to transition, develop improved preservation compounds to extend post-biological functionality, design workstations optimized for corpse retention. The report was dated 4 years ago. It had been approved by 17 different administratum functionaries. Implementation was already underway. I attended an administratum briefing 3 weeks later. I walked into the conference hall with a crowd of mid-tier functionaries, wearing a stolen identification badge and carrying a data slate I'd taken from an unattended desk. No one questioned my presence. The mid-level bureaucracy was vast and anonymous. Everyone assumed someone else had authorized any given person's attendance. The presentation was titled, Labor Optimization Through Biological Transition Management. The presenter was a senior administrator with extensive augmetic enhancement, one of those functionaries so modified that determining their original biological characteristics was impossible. They could have been any age, any gender, any origin. The augmetics had homogenized them into pure administrative function. They displayed graphs showing declining food costs across sectors implementing enhanced preservation protocols, charts demonstrating reduced medical expenditure in sectors with optimized worker lifecycle management, projections of improved output consistency in sectors utilizing post-transition labor retention. The functionaries nodded approvingly. One asked about the long-term sustainability of biological workers under reduced metabolic load. The presenter answered with statistics about chemical preservation rates and neural pathway retention in corpses. They discussed this like crop rotation, like optimizing machinery maintenance schedules. Someone asked about worker morale. The presenter responded that morale ceased to be a variable in post-transition workers, another advantage of the model. Someone asked about potential for worker resistance or labor organization. The presenter noted that post-transition workers lacked the capacity for collective action. Another efficiency gain. Someone asked about the ethical implications. The presenter stared at them for 5 seconds before responding, "Efficiency is the Imperium's highest ethical mandate. These protocols serve that mandate optimally." No one asked another question. The briefing concluded with implementation timelines. The ghost sector model would expand to 50 additional sectors within the next fiscal year. Chemical saturation protocols would be intensified across all manufactorum sublevels. Worker transfer policies would be adjusted to accelerate the transition process. Projected completion of full implementation, 12 years. In 12 years, the entire manufacturing workforce would be dead and working. I left the briefing. No one noticed. I returned to the burn levels because I no longer knew where else to go. My HAB unit had been reassigned months ago. I'd stopped returning after my designation changed, and the administratum reclaimed unoccupied housing within 48 hours. I had no possessions beyond the work uniform I wore. No identification beyond the designation tag that marked me as simultaneously promoted and absent. I existed in the system's gaps, categorized but not observed. I thought about escaping. The manufacturing levels weren't sealed. There were access corridors to the upper levels, transportation hubs that connected to other sectors. In theory, I could walk away, disappear into the hive city's billions, become anonymous among the anonymous. But where would I go? The entire hive operated on the same principles. Different industries, different specific toxins, but the same fundamental logic. Extract maximum value from minimum investment, optimize efficiency at the cost of everything else, treat humans as renewable resources to be consumed until exhausted and then rendered into components for further consumption. The manufacturer was just the most honest about it. I returned to my station, Sector Gamma 12, Burn Level 7, Station 47. The designation was carved into the metal framework. I wondered how many people had worked this station before me. How many had died here? How many were still working here? their preserved corpses outlasting their identities. Keller's replacement was dead now too. She'd lasted 8 months, better than average for the burn levels. The woman who replaced her looked 14 years old, malnourished and exhausted, hands already scarred from previous industrial work. She'd last maybe 6 months, maybe less. She kept glancing at me, the only person who'd looked at me directly in weeks. She could tell something was wrong. The living always could on some instinctive level. There was something off about my movements, my stillness, my presence. I was wrong in a way that triggered primitive survival instincts. But she didn't report it. Who would she report it to? The overseers who walked past me without seeing. The servitors that classified me as equipment. I wanted to warn her, to explain that the moment you became invisible was the moment you stopped being exploitable and started being simply exploited. That death wasn't termination of service, but transition to a more efficient form of labor. That the system would work you until your body fell apart, and then continue working the parts. But she wouldn't hear me. I'd tested it. I could stand directly in front of living workers and speak, and they'd look through me. The administrative designation that had severed me from oversight had also severed me from recognition. I was infrastructure now, as invisible as the ventilation systems and as regarded as the corroded pipes. I tried anyway. During a shift when the overseers were conducting an inspection 3 sectors away and the nearest servitor was occupied with material delivery, I approached her station. "You need to understand what's happening here," I said. She didn't react. Continued working. "They're killing us deliberately," I continued. "The chemical saturation isn't accidental exposure, it's intentional. They're turning us into corpses that keep working because corpses are more profitable than living workers." No response. Her hands moved through their programmed motions. "You're going to die here. In 4 months, maybe 6, and then you're going to keep working for another 4 months. And no one will notice and no one will care because your productivity metrics will still be green. Nothing." She assembled another component, placed it on the conveyor, began another. I reached out to touch her shoulder, to force some kind of acknowledgement. My hand passed through empty air. She was there, solid, I could see her. But when I tried to make physical contact, there was nothing. I'd become so disconnected from material existence that I couldn't even touch another person. I returned to my station, picked up the trigger mechanism that I'd apparently been assembling while my consciousness wandered, completed the assembly, placed it on the output conveyor, began another. The woman at the adjacent station, the 14-year-old with the scarred hands, stopped moving. Her hands froze over her work. Her breathing became imperceptible. I counted the seconds, 41, 70, 112. Her hands started moving again, but her eyes stayed empty. She'd crossed over. She'd discovered that invisibility was safer than presence, that the system only noticed you when you failed, that perfection was achieved through absence. She'd be dead within a week. Her body would keep working for another month, maybe longer if the chemical saturation was sufficient. The overseers would never know. The quotas would be met. I wondered if this was what I looked like to others, a body moving through programmed motions, consciousness so diminished that awareness became optional. Was I still alive? Did the distinction matter? I met quota. I maintained output consistency. Those were the only metrics the system valued. I began experimenting with the boundaries of my condition. I discovered I could go 48 hours without breathing at all. My body had adapted to extracting oxygen from the chemical-saturated air through some process I didn't understand. Passive absorption through skin, maybe, or cellular adaptation that bypassed normal respiration. My heart rate had become so slow and irregular that I couldn't reliably detect my own pulse. My body temperature had dropped to match the ambient environment. By every measurable standard, I was dead. But my hands worked, my stations met quota. The output metrics remained green. I tested structural boundaries. I stopped eating entirely. My digestive system had ceased functioning months ago, but I'd maintained the habit of consuming the nutrient paste distributed during rest cycles. I stopped. My body weight continued to decline, but more slowly than it should have. The chemical saturation was replacing biological mass. I was becoming more chemical than organic, preserved and mummified, while still nominally alive. I stopped sleeping. Sleep had become unreliable anyway, a state of partial consciousness where I couldn't determine if I was asleep or awake. So I stopped trying. I worked through the rest cycles, assembling components in an empty sector while the living workers retreated to their hab units. The overseers didn't patrol during rest cycles. The servitors operated on reduced schedules. I was alone with the other corpses, working in darkness interrupted only by the dim emergency lighting. I lost track of time. The chronometers were covered, and I'd lost the ability to estimate durations accurately. Days blurred into undifferentiated continuity. I worked. I assembled. I met quota. The intervals between one moment and the next stretched into something that might have been hours or might have been seconds. I thought about my mother sometimes, tried to remember her face. The memories were degrading, becoming unreliable. I remembered she'd worked the same line I worked now. Remembered she'd died from lung crystallization. Remembered that they'd given me her designation before her body cooled. But her face was gone. Her voice was gone. She'd become a fact without content, a piece of information disconnected from lived experience. I thought about Keller. Remembered her more clearly because the memory was fresher. Her three-fingered hand, her yellowed eyes, her whispered explanations of what was happening to us. She'd understood before I did. She'd tried to warn me. I wondered if she'd known she was training her own replacement, passing on the knowledge of how to survive in a system designed to consume you. I thought about Hess, the woman in the burn levels who'd questioned a quota increase and been transferred here as punishment. She'd lasted 7 months, died at her station, worked for another 3 months as a corpse. I'd watched her body gradually fail, joints dislocating, skin sloughing off, until the structural collapse became too severe and the servitors removed her. She'd never complained, never protested, just worked until she couldn't work anymore, and then kept working until her body physically couldn't maintain the motions. I thought about all the workers I'd watched die, hundreds of them across my years in the manufactorum, each one a person once, each one reduced to a designation and an output metric, each one consumed by a system that valued productivity over existence. And I thought about what I'd become. Something that existed in the space between living and dead, visible and invisible, human and equipment. I'd crossed so many boundaries that I no longer knew which side I was on. I met the system's requirements perfectly. I was productive, consistent, and cost nothing to maintain. I was the ideal worker. I was exactly what they wanted us to become. The foreman conducted his monthly inspection on the first day of a month I couldn't identify. He walked the line with his data slate, recording output metrics and efficiency ratings. He'd been a worker once, decades ago. Now he was augmetic and administrative, transformed by the system he'd survived. His lungs were metal, his skin was synthetic, his eyes were optical sensors that recorded everything and felt nothing. He paused at my station, turned, looked directly at me. It was the first time in months anyone had acknowledged my presence. "You've been here 9 months," he said. His voice was filtered through a Vox grill, flat and emotionless. "Survival rate for burn-level workers is 11% past 6 months. You're an outlier." I said nothing. Speech was inefficiency. "Your output metrics are exceptional. Consistency rate 98%. 0 defects in your last 4,000 units." He tapped the data slate. "Administratum has flagged you for performance citation. Continued excellence will result in promotion to oversight candidacy. He waited. I was supposed to express gratitude, to demonstrate the appropriate enthusiasm for advancement within the system. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. How many of your workers are dead right now? His expression didn't change. The augmetics couldn't simulate human reaction, and whatever remained of his organic face had been trained into administrative neutrality. But he glanced at his data slate, swiped through several screens, and answered with the casual precision of someone reading weather metrics. 17 confirmed. Another 33% probable based on biometric absence. Acceptable range for this sector. He looked at me again. Why? Because I stopped breathing 40 minutes ago, I said. And you're the first person who's noticed I'm here. That wasn't quite true. I'd stopped breathing in any meaningful sense 3 months ago. But the statement achieved its purpose. The foreman's optical sensors focused on me with increased intensity, scanning, analyzing, measuring. Biometric reading, null, he stated after 5 seconds. Classification, equipment, designation status, active. Output metrics, optimal. Another pause, anomalous combination, flagging for administrative review. Don't, I said. Your review will discover that I'm more productive dead than alive, that I cost nothing to maintain, that I represent the optimal realization of your efficiency initiatives. And then, you'll have to explain to the administratum why you're flagging optimal performance for review. He stared at me for 18 seconds. I counted. Then he marked something on his data slate and walked away without another word. My designation tag updated 30 seconds later, promoted to oversight candidate. Manufacturum sector Gamma -12. Report for administrative processing at shift end. I didn't report. I returned to my station and worked. No one came to retrieve me. No disciplinary action triggered. The promotion existed in the database but lacked any procedural follow-through. I'd been promoted into a category that had no implementation protocol because oversight candidates were supposed to be living workers capable of exercising judgment and authority. The system didn't know how to process a promotion for something it had already classified as equipment, so I remained in gap, simultaneously promoted and ignored, elevated and invisible, recognized as exceptional and unobservable as present. That was 4 years ago. Or maybe it was 4 months. Or 4 days. Time has lost its sequential quality. I experience duration as a continuous present, always assembling, always working, always meeting quota. The intervals between moments have collapsed. I don't know if I've been here for years, or if my consciousness has fragmented, and what I perceive as years are actually hours. I'm still here. Still at Station 47, Sector Gamma -12, burn level 7. My skin has the same waxy translucence I saw in the corpses I used to observe. My fingers are black to the knuckles, the tissue fully necrotic but still functional. I haven't eaten in... I don't remember. Haven't slept in longer. Haven't felt my pulse in so long that I've forgotten what it felt like to have a heartbeat. But my hands work. They move through their patterns with the precision of muscle memory reinforced by millions of repetitions. I meet quota every shift. The output metrics stay green. I've explored the entire manufacturum during my wandering periods. All 73 sectors, all 19 sublevels. I've counted the dead, 463 confirmed, probably 800 actual. Some have been at their stations so long their skin has fused with the equipment. The servitors clean around them. The overseers mark their output as acceptable. I've found sectors I don't remember discovering before. Sometimes I think I'm finding new areas. Sometimes I think my memory is failing and I'm rediscovering places I've already explored. The manufacturum might be expanding, or I might be fragmenting. Both could be true. The ghost sector has expanded. It's no longer 73 stations, it's 419. Multiple sub-levels now operate without any living workers. The efficiency ratings are exceptional. The administratum has accelerated the implementation timeline. Full transition to post-biological labor, 8 years now instead of 12. They're ahead of schedule. I've watched the transition happen in real time. Sectors that were 40% living, 30% living, 20%, then zero. The living workers die at their stations and keep working. The overseers stop patrolling. The servitors handle everything. The output improves. I attended another administratum briefing last week, or last month, or last year. The timeline is uncertain. But I was there, standing in the back of the conference hall, invisible among the functionaries. The presentation was a progress report on the Metabolic Efficiency Reduction Initiative. The results exceeded projections. Labor costs had declined by 71% in sectors utilizing post-biological workers. Output had increased by 48%. Defect rates had dropped to near zero. Worker complaints and resistance had been eliminated entirely. The model was being exported to other manufacturing complexes across the Hive City, then to other Hive cities, then to other worlds. The presenter showed projections for the next decade. The Imperium's entire industrial workforce transitioning to post-biological labor, trillions of workers dying at their stations and continuing to produce. The efficiency gains would be unprecedented. The resource savings would fund expanded military production. The Imperium would become stronger through the perfection of its labor model. Someone asked about the long-term sustainability of corpse-based labor. The presenter explained that chemical saturation techniques were being refined continuously. Current models showed post-biological functionality lasting an average of 8 months. New preservation compounds in development promise to extend that to 14 months. Enhanced workstation designs would support corpse retention for even longer. Someone asked what happened when the corpses finally failed structurally. The presenter explained that the biomass was reclaimed and processed into nutrient paste for the remaining living workers. Full resource utilization, zero waste, perfect efficiency. Someone asked if there were any ethical concerns about building an industrial model based on working corpses. The presenter's response was the same as 4 years ago. Efficiency is the Imperium's highest ethical mandate. No one asked another question. I left the briefing, walked back to the burn levels, returned to my station, picked up a trigger mechanism and continued assembling. The woman at the adjacent station is different from yesterday, or maybe it's the same woman and I'm misremembering. She's young, thin, scared. She keeps glancing at me with the instinctive recognition that something is wrong. She can sense what I am. Not living, not quite dead, something between categories. She'll understand soon. She'll discover that the system only notices you when you stop breathing. That invisibility is safer than presence. That the perfect worker is one who costs nothing and produces everything. That death is just a transition to a more efficient form of existence. She'll die here. In 4 months, maybe 6, and then she'll keep working, and no one will notice, and no one will care, because they only notice you when you stop breathing, and I stopped breathing so long ago that I've forgotten what breath felt like, but I meet quota. Every shift, every interval, every measurement period, my output consistency is 99.6%. I am the perfect worker. I require no food, no rest, no medical intervention, no disciplinary oversight, no acknowledgement, no humanity. I am labor reduced to its purest form, all inefficiency eliminated. They promoted me for it. They marked me as exceptional. They lifted me out of the category of tracked personnel and into the gap where documentation exists but observation doesn't. They made me invisible. And in my invisibility, I've become what they wanted all along. Not a worker, not a person, just production. Pure, efficient, endless production. The smell doesn't bother me anymore. I don't smell it, I've become it. The chemicals have saturated me so thoroughly that I am indistinguishable from the atmosphere. I am the reek of promethium and rendered fat. I am the corrosive sweetness of preservation compounds. I am the background toxicity that kills everyone who breathes it. The new woman at the adjacent station has stopped moving, her hands frozen over her assembly. I count the seconds. 37, 62, 91. Her hands start moving again. Her eyes stay empty. She's crossed over. She's discovered what I discovered years ago, that the only way to survive is to die, that the only way to be safe is to be invisible, that the only way to be perfect is to cease being human. The servitors pass without pausing. The overseers don't descend. The output metrics stay green. The manufactorum continues its transformation. Living workers dying at their stations and discovering that death doesn't end the shift. The ghost sectors expanding. The administratum calculating the savings. The Imperium growing stronger through the perfection of consumption. And I continue, assembling trigger mechanisms that will arm soldiers who will fight wars I'll never see. Components that will kill people whose deaths will mean nothing to anyone. Products that will serve an empire built on the principle that everything, including human life, is a resource to be extracted and exploited until exhausted. My hands complete another trigger mechanism, place it on the conveyor, begin another. The shift has an unknowable number of seconds remaining, then another shift, then another, forever. An eternity of assembly, of production, of meeting quota. I've stopped counting the days, the months, the years. Time has lost meaning. There is only the work, the endless, efficient, perfect work. The woman beside me topples off her stool. The corpse hits the floor with the wet sound of meat on metal. The servitors converge. A replacement arrives. The line continues. I continue. They only notice you when you stop breathing. I haven't breathed in so long I've forgotten what air tasted like before it was poison. But I meet quota, and that's all that's ever mattered. That's all that will ever matter. Forever.